Half-Life was one of the first games I played. There was at least 3 other games before it that I finished to completion, but games weren't a huge part of my life yet. Now, as of posting this video, I'm 21. I didn't play Half-Life when I was young, certainly not when it first came out, and by the time I finally did play it, the visuals were quite dated. My first glimpse of Half-Life was on a classmate's laptop. I was in Year 9 and we had all been given cheap netbooks as part of a government education scheme, so there were a lot of USBs floating around classrooms loaded with games, movies and TV shows. Half-Life was of course one of those games, and when the USB it was stored on came to my desk, I naturally took a copy. This was the first time I had played any first-person shooter, and I wasn't naturally good at it. But Half-Life was perhaps the best introduction to the genre. In the beginning of the game, there are no guns, no enemies, and no threats. You only need to find your way to your occupation, don your HEV suit, and generally harass the employees you meet on the way. This was great. It gave me time to understand the mechanics of movement in a 3D space, time to get used to controlling the camera and movement independently, something I was still quite new to. From there, you inadvertently cause a resonance cascade, and all hell breaks loose, albeit slowly enough that you can get used to the gameplay and systems the game introduces along the way. You see a crowbar, you pick it up, you swing it. You pick up a shotgun, you fire it. Revolvers have a lot of recoil, crossbow bolts follow an arc, and you need to keep an eye on both your health and suit condition before and during any battles. At the time, it was a lot to learn, but Half-Life was paced wonderfully, and although crouch jumping gave me a little trouble at first, I learned quickly. Half-Life 2's introduction also had an extended segment without weapons, and I love that intro as well, but it's not as hard to imitate it the second time round, and truth be told, as good as Half-Life 2's introduction is, it feels a bit removed from the meat of the game. Half-Life left a strong impression on me. I loved the game, the mechanics and the way every weapon felt useful even later in the game, as well as the subtle and somewhat abstract narrative. And the opening moments of Half-Life 2 promised the same. While individual scenes certainly matched the majesty of the first game, as a whole, I don't think it did, and a lot of that had to do with the introduction, or rather, the introductions. Now, just let me fully explain what I mean before you point out I just said I liked it, and that it was largely the same as the first game. My issue isn't with the opening scenes of the game, but rather that they aren't the only introduction. What I'm trying to get at here is that the mechanics and gameplay elements are introduced in a piecemeal manner over and over again, and these many small introductions feel a little forced in comparison to the original. Take the first weapon you acquire, for example, the crowbar. In Half-Life, it's in front of a pane of glass you need to smash, the purpose and use immediately obvious, but very much presented naturally. In Half-Life 2, it's given to you by Barney as though it were God's gift to mankind, a weapon of extraordinary importance, which pulls me out of the game immediately. Yes, I get it, the crowbar has become famously associated with the Half-Life and is something of an icon for the game, but it's not at all important in the world of Half-Life 2. So Barney's joking implication of greatness for what is a simple tool feels a bit wrong, except as a joke. The introduction of the gravity gun poses another issue. It features 2 tutorials for the one weapon, one in the scrapyard with Alex, and one in Ravenholm on your own. The first is awkward and breaks the pace introduced in the previous chapters, which would be nice if there was a little more in the way of characterization of Alex, but instead it is very much a straightforward tutorial, and that's made all the more disappointing when the Ravenholm chapter so wonderfully teaches you how to use the gravity gun in combat without a single word of dialogue. Half a corpse pinned to a wall by a saw blade straight away tells you all you need to know, and once you pick it up, the zombies that file into the room give you the target for what you've just learned. Valve are very good at this sort of non-verbal communication, and a little more of it in the scrapyard instead of a somewhat forced tutorial would have been great. Okay, so I've established my issue with the way introductions are sometimes more forced than they should be in the sequel, so now I want to discuss the elements that Half-Life 2 excels in, but why that excellence is sometimes to the detriment of the game as a whole. Firstly, the visuals are phenomenal. They look great even today, and the aesthetic characteristics the game goes for help make up for the low resolution textures and poly counts that belies the game's age. Sharp angular lines make up run-down apartment blocks and oppressive combine structures, while a smattering of graffiti and peeling paint textures give the world of Half-Life 2 a distinct vibe that's a real pleasure to explore. In terms of gameplay, the sequel again comes out in front, with clever use of physics that, although sometimes obnoxiously overused in puzzles, adds a sense of heft to the world that the first game can't match, and the sheer quantity of mechanics the game boasts is impressive for the linear style of game it is, boasting 2 different vehicle segments with a vastly different feeling for each, a physics-based weapon that allows for a variety of creative uses, and big improvements to 3 of my favourite weapons from the first game, those 3 being the wonderfully tactile shotgun, the raw power of the revolver, and the incredibly satisfying crossbow. It would be hard to argue that the first game had the better gameplay, for it certainly doesn't, but there's a focused vision to the first that is hard to describe and largely missing in the second. What lies at the core of that focused vision, in my eyes, is the atmosphere. Now, Half-Life 2 had some great atmospheric moments, some of which surpassed those in the first game, but as a whole, I think the original is far better in this respect. This is where I delve into specific moments in both games, some of which might spoil your experience if you haven't played either game. If you want to go into the series without any expectations, now's the time to leave. Firstly, let's look at the good points for both, the points that, in my eyes, really make the Half-Life series what it is. Both games evoke a variety of atmospheres and moods that feel unique and stunning. When you reach this bridge in Half-Life 2 and feel the train rattle the supports you are crossing, the atmosphere is intense, palpable, and beautiful without losing the menace the series oozes. This is my favourite stretch in the game for this reason. It perfectly blends a unique atmosphere with the world that surrounds it. The train that shakes the underside of the bridge forewarns you of the train that comes after it once you're on top of the bridge. It feels connected and involved. So too does this segment in the first game, when, after trying to reach the surface for so long, you're forced back under it by the military presence that awaits you there. It's uniquely frustrating, but it also reveals the full scale of the military operation that Black Mesa is targeted by. Finally, your reason to reach the surface has been left behind in the face of insurmountable opposition. Now you need to fix what caused this mess. The difference for me is that all of the moment-to-moment action of Half-Life precedes the next moment. Every action has context, place, a reason to exist. Nothing completely surprises you because you're told what's coming next. You know you need to launch a satellite before you eventually do so. You know that this portal will take you to Zen because you were told so. This doesn't spoil the surprise of the reality of Zen, or the sense of scale as you exit a tunnel on the side of an immense mesa. It just allows a feeling of world beyond that which is immediately in front of you, so it makes sense when you eventually get there. So why does the sequel lack this sense of cohesion? Why do I feel like it is segmented and broken up in a way that hurts the atmosphere of the game as a whole? There are a few reasons, but these are the major 2. 1. Almost every person and location mentioned in Half-Life 2 is met or explored in the game's runtime, despite not being told you will need to go there. And 2. Mechanics and systems introduced in one segment frequently don't carry over to the rest of the game. Starting with the first reason, I'm sure some of you might be wondering why that matters. Isn't it kind of cool that they mention, say, Nova Prospekt before you have any reason to go there? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, it builds anticipation and suspense for what it will be like once you get there. But on the other hand, it's the only prison-like facility that's mentioned. As far as you know, it might be the only one, which makes the game world feel smaller than it should. By itself, this isn't a problem, but when these coincidences are paired with a second reason, the game begins to feel fragmented. In the lead up to assaulting Nova Prospekt, you gain the control over antlion hordes, which you use to devastating effect. I love this sequence, it really feels like a cool mechanic and a clever use of NPCs as a weapon. But just after being shown its effectiveness, you never use the bug bait again. It's a trick you learn once and seemingly forget. In Ravenholm, you're introduced to saw blades as a satisfying and devastating weapon, and then they never really crop up again. Sure, you do command a squad of people later in the game, and you do see bricks and barrels to use against the Combine in other moments as well. But there's a clear delineation between Ravenholm and the rest of the game, between Nova Prospekt and the rest of the game. Essentially, these feel like levels in a series that was initially praised for the lack of traditional video game structure, and it feels like a step back to me. That's not to say I don't enjoy Ravenholm or Nova Prospekt. I only use them as examples for breaking the flow of the game, and in doing so pulling me out of the overall world that the game builds. It's because of these breaks in the flow of the game that the opening sequence is one of my favourite parts of the game. It's such an oppressive but simultaneously exciting world to be a part of that leaving City 17 is disappointing, and the dramatic shifts in tone, good as they might be when considered individually, lessen my experience with that world as a whole. So that's why I think there's something lost in the jump to the sequel. Ultimately, I think Valve were more interested in showing off what could be done with the new Source engine, rather than using the engine for a particular purpose. And that's what hurt the game. They put in some wonderful character animations, but little reason to use them. A vast and exciting array of weapons that sometimes aren't useful or even usable at all for the majority of the game, and a final sequence that fell short of what the opening promised. Half-Life 2 might have better gameplay, characters, and voice acting, but the world and atmosphere of the original just can't be topped. By no means do I think that Half-Life 2 is a bad game. It's still one of my favourites, but I prefer the focused, relentless atmosphere of the first to the wandering tone of the second. There was just a magic to the first that was lost in the sequel. So what do you think? Does Half-Life 2 surpass the original or fall short? Does a cohesive atmosphere matter to you, or does gameplay trump all? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're there, let me know how I can improve these videos. Any advice, tips or criticisms would be greatly appreciated. Cheers, have a good one. You're still here? Well, maybe you'd be interested in this video. Click here, check it out.